Hello, Sid here. Welcome to part 1 of me memoirs. Or maybe that should be memoirs, because she's in it so much. Anyway, hope you enjoy it. I'm off to get on with part 2 now. Ever since I could remember, the only thing I ever really wanted as a kid was a bike. I must have spent a massive part of my early childhood with me nose pressed up against Kingston Cycle's window, eyeing up all of the various delights on offer with me heart racing in tandem, until Mam would have to drag us away saying, "We can't afford it, whether it's Kingston Cycles or any other bike shop in Hull." And then she'd say something about Pratt's, which wasn't like her at all. Not that I didn't have plenty of other stuff I could do by way of playing out. Knock off ginger for starters. You know, knocking on people's doors and running away, basically. It's got different names depending on where you go in the country. Like this one time, I was trying to explain knock off ginger to this Cockney bloke, and he thought I was trying to sell him some stolen root seasoning. And they have the audacity to reckon we're daft. Then he starts going on about East End hardmen. You know, as they do, and he asked me where you can find any gangsters in Hull. Well, I thought he'd said ginsters, so I said you could try Bob Carver. He was practically drooling, especially when I started telling him about the filleting and battering process. He was like, "What, he removes the bones and puts them in a deep fat fryer? That's brutal, mate, brutal." I didn't have the heart to spoil it for him. Another game we used to play was off-ground tig, which speaks for itself, really. We had this one kid in our street who was so determined to win at off-ground tig, he used to come out in a tansad. You know the sort of kid who takes his football in if he's losing, or gets his mam to stop the music in just the right place when you're playing past the parcel. Anyway, we soon put a stop to that. What we did was strap him in and put him outside this bloke's house, who Mam had told me worked down Arnold Lane and had a strange hobby. Then we knocked on the door and just left him to it. I tell you what, he never came out in a tansad again. He never came out. Full stop. Not because he was traumatised or anything. Nah, he'd moved to a Barrett house. I had to ask me Mam what one of those was, and she said even though people go on about them, she thought they were a bit wimpy. You know, construction-wise. One of my older brothers reckoned it was what he would call a cautionary tale, meaning if you ain't got your feet on the ground and you take a little trip and then knock on the wrong door, you could end up in a Barrett house. Speaking of tales, that was another thing about Mam. She always had plenty of stories she used to tell me. She had loads of them. The one that always used to get me the most was the one she used to tell me about a naive red-haired boy who goes to a place called the Land of Green Ginger to look for the world's smallest window, only to find it and then end up being really disappointed. But then he realises disappointment is part of life, and as a result he becomes less naive. As Mam used to say, bit disappointed, a bit less naive. And she'd had more than a fair share of disappointments, and was anything but naive. Not that she made them all up by herself, though. She wasn't entirely beyond changing somebody else's story to suit her own. There was this one she used to tell me, a chocolate orange, about a massive chocolate factory on Great Thornton Street, that was round the corner from a dairy, a milk bar she called Corova, and a lemonade stand called Foggy Pop, and all of them were positioned apparently in such a way that they had an effect on how the chocolate tasted. As Mam told it, the factory was owned by a man with a funny name and what she described as having an eccentric appeal, especially as far as kids were concerned. She reckoned his success was mostly down to him capturing and taking advantage of a large group of workers from the third world, who he fed on not much more than what nowadays you'd call an all-you-can-eat buffet. What he did was dress them up in white boiler suits and black bowler hats and subject them to a continuous soundtrack of the old Ludwig van, whilst giving them directions in a language called sat-nav. Left at the everlasting gobstoppers, my little droogies. He then sets up this massive publicity campaign so he can lure a bunch of children to the factory, and with nothing in the way of health and safety, maims and disfigures 4 of them just because they've got too much to say for themselves. Before he finally decides that the 5th kid, a token poor kid, who'll pretty much do as he's told, becomes the winner and then continues the factory owner's legacy. Later on, when we did the story at junior school, I shouted out, "That's Mam's story, and that's not how you pronounce his name." And then I went and told the teacher how you say it the right way. Oh, I got into a fair bit of trouble, and I was a bit disappointed. But then I realised, a bit disappointed, a bit less naive. Anyway, let's get back to the start. I actually grew up on Sienna Street, which I thought was an odd name for a street. Sienna Street. I mean, Sienna then what? What is it we're comparing it to here? Then, of course, I realised it runs alongside Coltman Street, so there's your answer. At the time, Coltman Street was the most notorious street in Hull, full of drugs and prostitutes, which meant that the police were always down there. Sometimes they'd go down there to arrest people as well. One time, I read an article in the local paper with the police saying that as far as Coltman Street was concerned, there's a whole catalogue of issues and therefore no quick fix. That was in the days before Screwfix, of course, if we're going to talk catalogues. I was actually born in the maternity hospital on Eden Road, right next to the prison. That was as close as I got to me dad back then. He was in there for armed robbery. What he'd done was try and steal an expensive bracelet off of a mannequin, and the whole limb had come away as well. Worse, when the police caught up with him, he tried to slip the mannequin's arm into the handcuffs and got done for resisting arrest on top of everything else. When it came to his trial, he had so much previous and so many other offences to take into account, they ended up throwing the book at him, which turned out to be great practice for working in the prison library. They're not the places of quiet contemplation you think they are, not by a long stretch. So he was inside when I came out, inside as in prison, that is. He tried to get the authorities to give him some compassionate leave so he could come and see us in hospital, but they wouldn't give him it, so he missed the birth. If truth be told, he missed the conception as well. But then why would you want to see that if you weren't the father? I mean, that's got to make for some uncomfortable viewing, hasn't it? Unless you've got some sort of an arrangement going on. As a result, Mam always insisted on 2 things. 1, I didn't get involved in any criminal activity, and 2, I didn't go to sea. And then a voice would trail off as she looked mournfully into the mid-distance. And I'd say, "Mam, what is it? What is it you don't want me to go and look at?" Because I had it even back then. She said, as far as crime's concerned, there's no fairy tale endings. Unless you count the time that Dad got stuck up a tree trying to get out of a house in Bean Street, and the owner threatened to chop it down with an axe to get him down from there. Presumably he didn't like the idea of him befriending his wife, let alone nicking his gold coins. So I lived down Sienna Street with Mam and me 3 older brothers, Stephen, who went by his middle name Leslie, Terence and Derek, or if you prefer, our Les, our Tez and our Des. They were in a working men's club band together called the STDs. They had a great repertoire. Stuff like Great Balls of Fire, I'd Rather Go Blind, Yellow River, Burning Love, and It's Getting Better. You know, stuff that really got under your skin. A review in the local paper said they had a very contagious way about them, transmitting something very catchy and infectious to the audience. They were actually a very capable bunch and brought a lot of different influences to the table. Les was more into rock, hippie and progressive music. Tez was into soul, funk and Motown. And Des was the drummer, and just like bashing things. Bashing out the frustrations of the entire family, as Mam referred to it, which was all very well, but it would have been nice if he could have found somewhere a bit more secluded to bash things out, given the amount of noise he used to make. They were a great band though, a really good original band, but a lot of the time they had to give the audience what they wanted, as there were still loads of Elvis and Buddy Holly fans around who wanted to hear their favourites. The Elvis fans were a bit of an odd bunch really. Most of them consisted of these overweight middle-aged guys still trying to pass themselves off as Elvis in his youth, whilst an overweight Elvis was busy dressing up as one of the Osmonds and performing karate moves on stage like he was having a nasty turn or something, limbs flailing around and what have you. Surprised they didn't call a doctor. Maybe there was something of a medicinal orientation on those scarves his flunky mate used to bring out to him. But according to our Les, the Buddy Holly fans were even worse, because if you did a cover of one of Buddy's songs, you had to get it just right, otherwise your name was mud. It wasn't until later on that they realised what the band name meant, so they had to change it. I mean, we didn't call it an STD back then. We called it VD, and I didn't know what that meant either. The only VD I knew of was Valdunican, and the most you could accuse him of would be spreading a particularly lethal form of easy listening that consigned people to rocking chairs, especially when he was at the same time contradicting himself by telling people to walk tall. And that's before we even get to the business of looking the world in the eye. I did ask Les one time, given that we called him Les rather than Stephen, why they didn't just change their name to the LTDs, but he said they'd thought of that and they reckoned that it was a bit limited. So in the end, they changed it to the Assedos, spelled A-S-S-E-D-O, which Les said is a whole thing, that when a person loses an argument or gets put in their place by someone, and then later, when they're telling somebody else about it, they try and convince them that they weren't. I said, oh. So yeah, they were a good band, but they weren't bringing enough in, so Mam had to go to work as well. She worked at various times at Bird's Eye, Rosin's and Smith and Nephews, which meant at the very least we never went short of fish fingers, shoes or germaline. And what we didn't have we could always trade. The germaline was especially useful for me, because being what you might describe as a miner, I was always falling over, and you never knew when a scab was going to strike. Without the germaline, they'd go really slow. There was always food on the table, which for the most part was your standard meat and 2 veg, or maybe something with chips. But when Mam was going to work, she'd often leave something for one of the lads to cook me, such as a Vesta curry or a Frey Bentos pie with a bit of smash, all of which I loved. But if the truth be told, I preferred real potato. I never really took to smash. It always tasted a bit alien to me, like something from another planet. And then for afters, it might be something like a freezer pop, Angel Delight, or my favourite, some Nesquik, which I realise, compared to nowadays, is no great shakes, but I used to love it. I never understood the name Smith and Nephew either. I mean, if the name Smith isn't anonymous enough, you've got this completely unidentified other person in the form of a brother or sister's offspring. I mean, how do you deal with that at a business meeting? Ah, come in, Mr. Smith. And who might this be? This is my nephew. And does your nephew have a name? Just nephew will do, thank you very much. It doesn't make any sense, does it? No matter how tough things got, though, there were always people willing to help out. I had so many aunties and uncles, I can't tell you which ones were the real ones or not. First off, there was the uncle who lent your mum money while your dad was in prison. We called him Uncle Boot, due to the fact he had one shoe with a much bigger sole on it than on the other. Mam said it was called an orthopaedic shoe, and for some reason, whenever he came round, our Des would always ask him whether it gave him 3D vision and the California blues, and then he'd start singing, "Orthopaedic shoes, orthopaedic shoes." I quite liked him, even though I wasn't supposed to know he was a lone wolf or a lone shark or whatever it was, but I still knew what was going on. Even when Mam, who was trying to protect me from the ways of the world, would reply to his question, "What can I get you?" by asking for a Gilbert O'Sullivan. Alone again, naturally. At which point, Uncle Boot would undo a compartment in his large-soled shoe and pass some money to Mam, and then pass a traffic light to me, saying, "Some lolly for you, and a lolly for you." Like I say, I quite liked him. Sometimes Mam was really pleased to see Uncle Boot and made a right fuss of him. Other times we all had to hide when he came round. Les called it a lupine-themed double bind. If we let him in, it's because we needed to keep the wolf from the door, and if we didn't, it was because we needed to keep the wolf from the door. Worse, if we were all hiding, you could hear him knocking on the window and saying stuff like, little pigs, let me in." One time, Des, who was presumably at a loss because he'd had to stop hitting things, replied, very quietly for him, "Not by the hairs on our chins," which annoyed all of us, but Mam especially, because she was a bit self-conscious about the occasional whisker appearing on the lower part of her face. Nothing she couldn't have probably dealt with by way of something from Smith and Nephews. But in any case, she was put out enough for her to stand up and shout at Des, "This is me, I've told you. You march to the beat of your drum, and I'll march to the beat of mine. It's not like I'm afraid to be seen." Unfortunately, at that point she realised she had been seen, as Uncle Boot was looking straight at her through the window. So we ended up having to let him in, and in the absence of any money, told him to help himself to Dad's watch, which stood untouched on the mantelpiece. After he'd left, Mam said, "He's welcome to it. He can shove it up his backside for all I care." A suggestion that wasn't lost on the rest of us, because that's how Dad had acquired it in the first place. Then there was your uncle who looked after your Mam while your Dad was in prison. There was a few of those. I can still remember some of them. There was Uncle Brian, he liked a bit of a drink. Uncle Steve, who I seem to remember liked wearing Mam's clothes and makeup. Uncle Andy, who had a high singing voice. And Uncle Mick, who actually taught Des a bit of drums. All of which were sweet, although Brian could be a bit of a hellraiser, especially if Mam let him out on a Saturday night. They were all very good when it came to helping Mam out as well. So much so, they were often already there and ready to go when I got up in the morning. Sometimes they were so keen to get what Brian called a piece of the action, it was them that actually woke me up, what with all the banging going on in the next room and what have you. But the one I remember most of all, probably because he came to live with us eventually, was Uncle Sandy. His surname was Beach, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that's how he ended up with the name Sandy. But it was down to the fact he was the caretaker at our local school and was always in the school playground cleaning up vomit. One auntie I'll never forget was Aunt Queenie, who lived on Malm Street. She was a fortune teller, and Mam called her a sage-like figure and said when it came to the supernatural, she really knew her onions. She was amazing. I used to go round there with Mam, and just before you were about to ring the doorbell, you could hear a voice saying, "Come in." It was uncanny, just like that hunchback of Nostradamus fella, who could also predict things, and also knew a thing or two about ringing bells as well. Anyway, once inside, her and Mam would talk for a while, and there'd be a certain amount of cards and palm reading going on, you know, that sort of thing, none of which caught my attention really. until one time Mam suddenly asked Queenie if she could read my tea leaves. Well, Queenie said she didn't normally do kids' readings, but she said she would as long as Mam provided parental guidance and I didn't try and make a monkey out of the process. Once again, though, it all seemed fairly uninteresting, until Queenie suddenly said that I was going to travel just like me dad. So I said, "What you on about? My dad's been in jail for most of his adult life. He's never been anywhere." But Queenie insisted. "Well, he must be breaking out every night and breaking back in first thing in the morning, 'cause it says here he's definitely travelled." Now, I don't know how much you can get out of the tea leaves, but I could see the strain on Mam's face, so I knew something was brewing. "Come on," Mam said weakly. "We'd better go." Well, it turned out me real dad was actually someone Mam had met, having just come away from visiting Dad in prison, and seeing that she was upset, he'd comforted her briefly. He'd comforted her briefly in a place called the Seaman's Mission. And that was it. She couldn't tell me much else, except that he'd sailed off to the Far East apparently to become a Buddhist, and that his name, and my middle name, was Arthur. Well, to say I was devastated would be an understatement. I mean, there's me believing my real dad is this bloke who sits around all day doing very little, and it turns out it's some other bloke who sits around all day doing very little. I mean, I don't know. You think of things in a permanent, fixed sort of way, and it turns out they're anything but. It's especially devastating after all Mam had said about semen as well. I mean, semen. I realise it was a load off her chest, but to me it just looked like she was rubbing it in. I was a bit disappointed, to say the least, but then I thought back. A bit disappointed, a bit less naive, and I did feel a little bit better as a result. I have since done a bit of research as far as tracking down my real dad's concerned, and even been to the Seaman's Mission to check their records, but to no avail, although I do still get their mail out, the Seaman's E-Mission. As for Queenie, we never went round again. I did ask Mam why that was, and she said, "Well, you either believe in it or you don't, do you?" She said she did manage to speak to Queenie about my reading, and though she didn't go into any detail, she did say, "I can tell you this much, there's no such thing as a happy medium." One of the big features of life back then for me was going on road. Hazel Road to be exact. But if you're local, on road. I mentioned going on road one time when I was chatting to this bloke in Oxford, and he made some sarcastic remark about not knowing that Hull had a large beatnik culture. I said, "Oh, if you're from Oxford, your name's Nick and you could do with a beating it has." Put him right in his place, I did, trying to make out like I'd never heard of Jack Caramack. He's probably the sort of guy who would pronounce it Hessel anyway. Hessel. It's not Hessel, it's Hazel. Like that song Liza with a Z, 'cause S spells Lisa. It's the same with boyses. You can always tell who these people are, 'cause they come up to you and ask, "Excuse me, do you know where I can find boys?" I think you've got the wrong idea about me, fella. Now you better be on your way before I call you out in front of everybody. Where can I find boys? Don't expect me to act as your scout. Anyway, to me, Hazel Road was the most magical place in the world. I can still recall all the various street names such as Liverpool, Manchester and Scarborough, like some Hull forerunner of Del Boy's van. As long as that van contains fish fingers, shoes and germaline, of course. There is the odd street name that's been tarnished, though. I used to love going to Madeley Street baths, but you wouldn't want to be swimming around in the pool now, would you, thinking about Richard Madeley? To be fair, I wouldn't want to be engaging in any sort of activity and thinking about Richard Madeley. It'd put you right off your stroke. There's a good enough reason for knocking the baths down right there. So what would happen was, I'd go on road with Mam, and after the usual drool down Kingston Cycle's window, we'd head off to Auntie Didlam's. Passing Eton and Harrow Street on the way, two of the poorest streets in Hull. Maybe spend a couple of club checks from Uncle Boot at Clothing House, which, contrary to the name, was actually a structure made entirely of bricks and mortar. And then we'd pick something up at Frank D's, a superstore owned by a gentleman named D, who had a very forthright manner. And all the time you're just surrounded by tons of local characters, just like worlds within worlds. Trawlermen swaying to and fro, looking like they hadn't adjusted to being back on dry land yet. But then you realised the wives had failed to head 'em off before they'd got to the pub with their wages, and they were basically 3 sheets to the wind, to use a nautical term. Then there were women everywhere pushing tansads, with kids in 'em no doubt dreaming up ways to play off-ground tig without ending up in a Barrett house. And blokes in vests in all kinds of weather. Diehards, Mam used to call 'em. She reckoned you could get a 6-pack of 'em from Willis's. They were always covered in tattoos, a lot of which were homemade. Mam wasn't very keen on tattoos, especially homemade ones, and told me I'd be better off avoiding them if I could. Not just because they were permanent, or because they had any health-related issues going on, but because she'd seen too many examples of what she called poor literacy. Like our Des, who'd wanted to get a tattoo on his shoulder in tribute to Mark Bolan, and ended up with one saying Electric Warrior. A big black and gold thing it was. Brings a whole new meaning to his songs though, doesn't it? I mean, you wouldn't want to be riding any white swans if you thought one could break your arm, would you? And as for Hubcap Diamond Star Halo, whatever that is, you wouldn't want one of those above your head. Not if you didn't want to end up in Hull Royal, you wouldn't. Worse still, though, Des had done one himself copying the front cover of that Slade album. You know, the one where they've got the band name written on their knuckles. And he'd managed to miss the L off. So he'd had to wait 10 odd years before his knuckles became musically relevant. And that's assuming you like soft jazz, which he didn't. Anyway, we'd go and see Auntie Didlam so that Mam could give us some money to keep for Christmas. We were saving up for a colour TV. Auntie Didlam lived on Subway Street, and we'd always stop in for a sandwich and some Nesquik for me. But we weren't able to stop too long, because Auntie Didlam was incontinent, bless her, and there was always a funny smell about the place. It's a good job we called her Auntie Didlam, really. Her actual name was Babs. Do you know, I once had a girlfriend from Birmingham, and even though I told her people in Hull were really friendly, she said she thought they were the complete opposite. And then I realised she was going round saying to everybody, "You're right, Bab." I mean, what do you expect? I don't go to Birmingham, do I, going, "You're right, Pooh"? You're going to end up putting your foot in it, aren't you? And while we're on the subject, she kept using the word cob as well, which I found really annoying. It's not a cob, it's not a bun, it's a bread cake. That's how we roll. I mean, you'll never get me going into Skelton's, will you, saying, "Can you sort me out with a couple of your baps, love?" Not unless I want to end up with them wrapped round me head, you wouldn't. I suppose it's all right me going on about how other people from other places talk, though. I mean, we've got a way of saying things that might get us into trouble as well. I mean, if anyone from London, Oxford or Birmingham asked you if they could do something, you'd have to be very careful when you told them no you couldn't, unless you were sneakily trying to tell them a home truth or two. I had no idea how we were ever going to afford a colour TV either. From what I could make out, we couldn't even afford a licence for the black and white one we already had, which Uncle Sandy reckoned meant we could only watch ITV, because the advertisers paid for that on our behalf, apparently. So we ended up watching loads of comedies with titles like Bless This House, Man About the House, and Doctor in the House, as well as others that suggested less of a sense of confinement. One time, though, our Les said he'd take me to see a colour TV, so I went with him to visit this hippie bloke who had one and lived by himself on Bachelor Street. But when we got there, it turned out it wasn't a colour TV at all. He'd just painted the outside box in psychedelic formation. which had more of an effect of making your eyes go funny, like sort of kaleidoscope eyes. Whilst we were there, he made us all an omelette, which for some reason I wasn't allowed to have any mushrooms in mine. And then we all settled down to watch a programme called The Likely Lads, which I'd never seen before. Next thing I know, despite the fact it's in black and white, they both start going on about the colours, and saying how cosmic the lyrics to the theme tune are, and saying them to each other. What happened to you? What happened to me? What became of the people we used to be? I couldn't see it at all, but to this day I'm still a massive fan of the Likely Lads. Massive! Right down to visiting all of the locations if I go to Newcastle. I even try to get the bus to pass me without stopping. Recently, I did one of those online quizzes. Which Likely Lad are you? And it turns out I'm Thelma. Apparently if you say stuff like, are you really thinking of going out dressed like that? Or don't be late, because we're visiting my mother tomorrow, that makes you a Thelma. Canny like, innit? Or uncanny like, depends how you look at it. Soon enough, summer would come round and before you knew it, we'd all be off on holiday to Withernsea. Or With, if you're local. Back then, everybody went to Withernsea. Nowadays, people go to lots of different places, so you're obliged to ask them, are you going anywhere nice? But back then, there would be no point. Are you going anywhere nice? I'm going to Withernsea, what you on about? What would happen then was, Mam, Uncle Sandy and me would pile into the STD's van. Having taken out all of the equipment, as well as the fish fingers, shoes, and most of the germaline, and Les would end up driving us all there. Tez didn't want to do it, because he'd reckoned he'd gone off Withernsea, because he said he'd caught crabs there, which struck me as a good thing. And Des had been getting on Mam's nerves and wasn't trusted with the job. He'd taken to ruining her blankets and pillows by using them to dampen the process of beating out his frustrations, which was expensive, so Mam was having to charge him percussion. We kept some of the germaline in the van though, because we'd always go and visit Dad on the way and sneak some into prison, so he could use it as a sort of internal lubricant when it came to exchanging favours with the other blokes in there. Smooth his passage inside. You know, a means to an end. But I used to love Withernsea, and I always felt there was something extraordinary about the place. I'm pretty certain the sea had healing powers for starters, because people were always leaving stuff on the beach like glasses, hearing aids and prosthetic limbs. If it weren't for the fact that he was too busy collecting money, I reckon Uncle Boot might have benefited from taking the waters at With. Mam reckoned that another part of With's magic was down to the fact that some of the population are made up of ancestors of shipwrecked sailors who back in the day had headed towards the lighthouse only to discover it was about a quarter of a mile inland. Like a siren, she said, luring them to their doom. Well, that all sounded a bit Greek to me, especially because if anybody in our family ever heard a siren, they'd run in the opposite direction. I mean, you wouldn't want to get tied up in any of that, would you? Mam also said that's why, when you get your sandcastle flags, there's lots of them from places you've never heard of. That's where the various shipwrecked sailors come from. And the one with the harp on it, there's always one with a harp on it, that's the one for the sirens. Soon enough, we'd arrive, and having dropped our stuff off at the caravan, we'd head into town for some fish and chips, and to spend a bit of time in the amusements there, which was called Teddy's. Now normally, we'd go to the beach in the morning, and then lunch, and then Teddy's, but as it was the first day, we headed straight for lunch. Either way, Uncle Sandy would always make me cringe, winking at Mam and then saying the same thing every day without fail. I like my women the way I like to spend my time in Withernsea, in Teddy's. Not what I would call much of an amusement. Eventually, we'd head back to the caravan, and after a little rest, Uncle Sandy would give me some money to go out again so him and Mam could tidy up the caravan. I wouldn't mind, but it never looked any tidier when I got back. If anything, it looked worse. Clothes everywhere, bedding upside down. I mean, if that was their idea of tidy, I wouldn't like to see things after a proper full-on blowout. It was only later that I realised they were probably ahead of the curve on this. I mean, if you go somewhere like Primark nowadays, people have exactly the same approach to tidying up. Just sling it on the floor. They're all doing it. It's commonplace. I said as much one time when one of the assistants was clearing up. I said to her, "You know this business of throwing stuff on the floor? My mum and dad are responsible for that." I thought she'd be more impressed. She just gave me a dirty look. Probably thought I was showing off. So they'd be tidying up, and what I'd do was take a walk on the beach, maybe treat myself to a donkey ride. I realised that nowadays donkey rides are a bit out of fashion and a trifle uncool, but from what I could see, the owners always gave the impression they wouldn't put up with any silly behaviour from anybody. So much so that when I did see someone having a lot off to a donkey, they ended up getting brayed. They made a right jackass of themselves. But like I say, Withernsea to me is a magical place. Apparently the Beatles were so taken with Withernsea, they actually named an album after it, With the Beatles. True. You only had to look at the front cover to realise what a profound effect it had on them. It's in there in some of the tunes as well, such as With a Little Help from My Friends, With In You and Without You, and stuff like Ticket to Ride, which is all about not being able to use actual money on some of the roundabouts. All of us had our own favourite Withernsea-inspired Beatles tune. With me it was Here Comes the Sun, 'cause I'm optimistic. Les liked Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, although he said it could just have easily been Day Tripper. Des liked Octopus's Garden, 'cause he's a drummer. And Tez reckoned it had been Got to Get You Into My Life, but since he'd caught crabs there, he reckoned it put him much more in mind of Why Don't We Do It in the Road. Although with crabs, I reckon you'd be thinking more in terms of doing it on the sidewalk. But yeah, even to this day, I can't get enough of Withernsea. Do you know what? I've heard it said there are folk there have never been as far as Hull. I think that tells you all you need to know about the very specific appeal of the place. It's just wonderful. Then before you knew it, we were back at school. I went to the primary school just round the corner from us, Constable Street. Named after a painter by all accounts. I thought it was another case of there being a constant police presence down there, but apparently not. But that's great, innit? I mean, imagine that. You've done such a good job decorating a whole street that they want to name it after you. It made me wonder what extraordinary act of civic duty Chris Chilton had performed at our nearest rivals just over the other side of the boulevard. I didn't mind school so much, and used to quite look forward to turning up on the first day in me brand new wellies. Some kids turned up in sannies, short for sand shoes or plimsolls, but Mam drew the line at them. She said there were levels and you shouldn't go below them. Not unless you want to get saturated, you shouldn't. And no first day back at school was ever complete without a visit from the knit nurse. We didn't call them knits back then. We called them dicks, which sounds totally wrong. I mean, can you imagine? Your hair's full of dicks. Totally wrong. Worse still, we had a rhyme. I made you look, I made you stare, I made you cut the barber's hair was full of dicks, I made you eat them all but 6. Tez said it reminded him of a girl he knew, a hairdresser, who was very popular within a circle of him and his mates. He reckoned she'd inspired him to write a song, which he'd totally forgotten about, until he'd heard something that sounded almost identical about 10 or so years later, right down to the name even. Eileen. It was at school that I first discovered my love of the stage. I started small playing an innkeeper in the school nativity. You know, one of the ones who turns Mary and Joseph away. That struck me as totally pointless, I mean, didn't they have no vacancy signs back in biblical times? It would have saved a lot of bother, wouldn't it? It'd have been a whole different story if Jesus had been born in Withernsea. But I must have done something right, because the next year I got a part in the school play, The Wizard of Oz. I played the Scarecrow, and I got a great review in the local paper. They said I was outstanding in my field, which knocked the stuffing out of me. I mean, it made me feel like I might have a brain in my head after all. Even though I didn't mind school, I still used to try and stay off every now and then. Like I said, I didn't mind it, but staying off was the only way that you could get Lucozade back then. And I loved Lucozade. You know, the original rust-coloured glucose-style AIDS recovery Lucozade. Back then there was only one flavour, and it was really difficult to get hold of. Nowadays it comes in lots of different flavours and anyone can get it. I saw one recently. Melon and cauliflower. I mean, that's just sad, isn't it? But even if I did stay off, I didn't feel like I was missing out. Mam would always tell me a story or two, or maybe talk about life. She had some great ready-made sayings she was always willing to pass on. Stuff like, if you love someone, set them free. If they come back, they clearly didn't get the message, did they? Or, if you can walk a mile in another person's shoes, it's probably best to only go half a mile, because they're going to want them back at some point, aren't they? You know, proper common sense stuff. Sometimes Les would do the honours, and having given up on trying to teach me about books like Steppenwolf or On the Road, he was making me recite stuff like, education in and of itself is a worthwhile pursuit, but the main purpose of schooling is to condition the individual into accepting without question a perceived set of societal norms that he or she thus replicates in the form of blind adherence to a hierarchical, mechanistic and ultimately capitalistic existence. After that I was always keen to get back to school. In truth, you didn't want to be off too much anyway, because you'd miss out on stuff, and it'd be really obvious when you got back. Like the time one of the teachers asked the class to name 2 things that Raleigh had brought back from the New World, and even though I'd been off, I put my hand up and said, the chopper and the tomahawk. That's how obsessed I was with bikes. Well, the teacher wasn't impressed at all. They called me a stupid get and said they'd get more sense out of a potato. But I didn't care, because I'd discovered something more important to my mind than any lesson about Walter Raleigh. I'd discovered I could make people laugh. My obsession with getting a bike had led me to something that was going to be a calling, and I wasn't talking about becoming an Avon lady. Autumn also meant that it wouldn't be long before the fair came around, and that was another thing I used to love. Mam wasn't so keen. She said it always put her in mind of that film Carousel. You know, the part where the main guy falls on his knife. Apparently Dad had done a similar thing, trying to nick one of those plastic swords off of a stall, and nearly did himself an injury. Not so much you'll never walk alone, more you'll never walk again. Well, not without the assistance of a pacemaker anyway. Mam did tell me an interesting thing though. Apparently, because of the fair, everybody on Walton Street has developed a really strong sense of community. So much so, they all say goodnight to each other before putting the lights out on a night. Go down there, you can hear them, she'd say. Good night, Elizabeth. Good night, Jason. After which, they'd all take it in turns for someone to play a little harmonica and a tiny xylophone. Anyway, Uncle Sandy would have to take me along. Always coming at it from the Anlaby Road end, obviously. I mean, even if we hadn't lived that way on, Uncle Sandy said we'd have to still come at it from the Anlaby Road end. He said to go from the Springbank West end was to go at things too quickly, and we'd end up experiencing the main event prematurely. He reckoned you should take your time getting there, working your way slowly and building up the excitement as you go. Maybe even grabbing the odd toy. And then he'd make me cringe again by saying, "It's pretty much the same way as I have to approach your mam." I can remember the first year he took me. We stopped at pretty much every stall on the way, which meant by the time I got to any rides, I was already full of brandy snap, candy floss, and plenty of other sweets that didn't immediately lend their name to those of exotic dancers. We went on loads of other stuff before we finally got to the waltzers, which he'd been promising to take me on all year. The lady looking after our car was big and tough looking and wearing a vest with lots of tattoos on display. A die-hard, basically. Because of her job, Uncle Sandy referred to her as a spinster, which would have been all right had she not heard him and then decided to give us the ride of our lives, just as the sounds of Son of My Father started kicking in as well. I tell you what, she spun us round so much and with such force, it wasn't long before I was throwing up everywhere, and in particular, all over Uncle Sandy, which I thought he'd be used to given his job. But he must have found it traumatising, because he was screaming his head off, shouting, "Hook a duck! Hook a duck!" or something like that. So that's what we did, once the ride had finished. Obviously once Uncle Sandy had removed all the traces of brandy snap and candy floss, as well as other sweets that didn't immediately lend their name to those of exotic dancers. We headed off to the Hook a Duck stall before winning, as you do, and then facing the biggest Hull Fair challenge of all, getting the goldfish home before it dies. Me personally, I was never able to get a fish to the other end of Walton Street before it had its chips. Of course, nowadays we all realise that keeping goldfish in bags at a fair is cruel. I heard a story that one year a group of fish rights activists came over from Goole and freed a load of them. Fish Rights in Goole they were called. It was through Fish Rights in Goole that I found out what the word acronym means, because they had a particularly memorable one. What they did, having grabbed them all off of the stalls, was take them over to Princess Quay. How they got them there I don't know, but it meant they could grow to their full size in a more suitable surrounding. They're still there today if you look. If you don't know, by the way, Princess Quay is a former dock in the centre of Hull, as opposed to the device that you use to open a can of luncheon meat. That'd be even worse, wouldn't it? Keeping a goldfish in a half can of luncheon meat. Still, I suppose it's a step up from keeping one in a pilchard can. And then before you know it, it's Christmas. One of the best things about Christmas for me is Mam would take me to the pantomime at New Theatre, knowing I was developing a love for the stage and all of that, and being as encouraging as she was. I never understood why they called it New Theatre though. It was built in 1939. Surely it should just have been called Theatre by then. I think there might have even been some sort of petition to change it at some point, but then rather than respond to any sort of pressure group, what they did more recently was knock the original down and build a more modern one, just so they could keep the name New Theatre. Honestly, the lengths the authorities go to avoid the will of the people. It's ridiculous, isn't it? I remember the very first panto I went to. It had local legend Norman Collier in it. And despite it being a really lavish sort of set, which they'd obviously spent a bit of money on, they must have stinted on the budget somewhere, 'cause his microphone kept cutting out. I was embarrassed for him. But to his credit, he handled it brilliantly, getting huge laughs out of the situation. A total pro. Years later, when I met the man, he told me it used to happen a lot, and as a result, he'd developed a routine to cope with it, to make it look as though it was all part of the act. What class! Being able to anticipate a faulty mic like that and pretending he knew what was going on. A lovely fella as well, and so open about the tricks he employed. You can't say that about every showbiz type you meet. Some of them would have just strung you along in that situation. I was always excited about Christmas But there was some stuff I never understood. I never understood why it was your parents went on about not talking to strangers all year, and then let an old man they'd never met come into your bedroom without supervision, who's going to give you a present if you were good. I mean, I can see why some kids played up like they did, just so they could avoid the experience. I just stuck a no vacancies sign outside my window, which I assumed did the trick. And I never understood why it was your parents got you all excited about Christmas and then spent most of it telling you to calm down. It's like filling you full of brandy snap, candy floss, and other sweets that didn't immediately lend their name to those of exotic dancers, and then telling you off when you threw up everywhere. I never understood why it was your parents would always go on about the fact they only ever got a Mars bar and an orange. Not just once, but all the time. I mean, didn't they have Jaffa cakes back then? It sounds like it could have saved a lot of bother. If they'd had chocolate orange flavoured Nesquik, I'd have been happy to have that as my only present. But I loved getting involved in the preparations, like emptying the big bottle of whiskey that Uncle Brian had left behind, and discovering that you had just about enough money to buy another big bottle of whiskey, basically. You're just accumulating empty bottles of whiskey, aren't you? Or getting a bunch of coat hangers, some glitter and some candles from Leslie's hippie mate in Bachelor Street to make an advent crown. Or strong-scented fire hazard if you prefer. I'm surprised there wasn't a public information film about that one. Somewhere between an unsupervised old man coming into your room and an advent crown burning the house down, Christmas could be quite scary in parts. Mam used to get me to help her write the cards as well, and we'd sort them out so we'd send the nicest ones to the people we liked the most. Anybody we weren't really keen on, we'd just send them one of those dodgy candle ones at the bottom of the box. Probably goes a long way to explaining why our mantelpiece was always full of dodgy candle cards. Not one, but all of them, without even a watch to separate them. On this particular year, Uncle Sandy had got a job during the Christmas holidays working as a Santa Claus in Hammonds. I say Hammonds, it could have been Bins, but I didn't like the sound of that. Hammonds sounds much more organic, doesn't it? I mean, who wants to hear people saying stuff like your mam goes shopping in Bins? It makes you sound impoverished, like people who wear sannies instead of wellies. Under normal circumstances, I'd visit Santa and really look forward to doing all right in the process. Les had always taught me that when I was asked what I wanted for Christmas, I should say, me personally, nothing. But world peace would be nice for all of the other little boys and girls in other countries, which would usually guarantee a great present. With Uncle Sandy doing it, I felt like I'd probably do all right anyway. So what happened was, Mam sent me up a floor while she went to look at the colour TVs. But as I got near to the grotto, I couldn't see Uncle Sandy, so I thought, 'cause I knew him, it'd be okay to go behind the curtain. As I got closer, I started to make out his voice, and the ladies saying stuff like, "I must say you fill those stockings really well," and "Yeah, but when are you going to give me my present?" Only to stick my head through the curtain and see one of the store assistants dressed as an elf, sitting right on Uncle Sandy's lap. Well, he nearly jumped out of his Santa's outfit and started saying stuff like, "We were just practicing. It's not how it looks. It's this lady's job to give me a hand. She was just rummaging around in my sack," which sounded like even more of a carry-on, like he was in a tight spot and he had to give it his best shot. Now the truth was, I really liked Uncle Sandy, and I'd probably never told Mam anyway, 'cause I wouldn't want to upset her, and I didn't want to see them split up. They were good together. But it must have sounded like I was going to, 'cause when I said I'm a bit disappointed, he obviously heard Mam's voice through what I was saying. I mean, whatever, I didn't tell her anyway. But guess what? Not only did we get our colour TV that year, I also got the bike I'd been after for so long. It was green, and I wasn't in the least bit disappointed.